I moved our entire pension into a new account and left exactly $98 behind. The next morning, my son came tearing through my front door, grabbed me by the collar, and screamed that I was ruining his life. His wife frantically tore through every drawer in my kitchen, crying that the feds were coming for them. My wife and I just sat there and smiled. And an hour later, they were both leaving my house in handcuffs. Before I tell you how a 74-year-old man outsmarted a massive federal fraud ring right from his living room, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family should be about love, not greed. The air conditioning in the bank lobby was always a little too cold, but on that particular Tuesday morning, it felt like it was freezing the blood right in my veins. I was just standing there holding my usual deposit slip, minding my own business. I had been coming to this same branch in suburban Chicago for over 2 decades. Greg, the new branch manager, walked out of his glass office with a wide, overly enthusiastic smile plastered across his face. He extended his hand, pumping mine vigorously. "Congratulations, Richard," he beamed, adjusting his expensive tie. I have to say that was one of the smoothest approvals I have ever seen. Brad is going to do great things with that new capital. I stared at him. The polite smile on my face froze. I had no idea what he was talking about. Brad is my 42-year-old son. He runs a medical supply distribution company. We kept our business completely separate. Approval for what exactly, I asked, keeping my tone light and conversational, though a strange knot was already forming in my stomach. "The small business loan," Greg replied, looking slightly confused for a fraction of a second before his eager smile returned. "The $4 million commercial expansion loan. Honestly, using your $2.8 million retirement portfolio as the primary collateral was a brilliant move. With your immaculate credit and that kind of liquid asset backing the application, underwriting pushed it through in record time." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. $2.8 million. That was not just money. That was 40 years of waking up at 4 in the morning. It was 40 years of inhaling concrete dust, swinging, framing hammers, and freezing on commercial roofing sites in the dead of winter. That money was my promise to my wife, Patricia. It was the absolute guarantee that no matter what happened as we aged, her medical care would be fully covered, and we would never be a burden to anyone. And Greg was standing here telling me that my life savings was tied to a $4 million commercial loan that I had never even heard of. I did not scream. I did not grab Greg by the collar. When you spend your life managing construction sites and dealing with crisis after crisis, you learn that losing your temper only blinds you. You have to stay calm if you want to survive. "Oh, yes." I forced a quiet chuckle, nodding my head slowly. "The boy works fast. Sometimes I cannot even keep up with all the paperwork he puts in front of me. You know how it is. Since we are on the topic, Greg, could you print me a summary of the accounts? Just the final approval sheets and the collateral agreements. I want to put them in my personal safe at home." "Absolutely, Richard. I will grab those for you right now." He walked away, leaving me alone in the lobby. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs. I felt a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I focused on my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. When Greg returned a few minutes later, he handed me a thick manila folder. I thanked him, walked out the heavy glass doors, and made my way to my truck in the parking lot. As soon as I closed the truck door, my composure shattered. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I tore open the folder and flipped through the thick stack of legal documents. I found the collateral pledge agreement. I found the asset transfer authorizations. And right there at the bottom of the last page was my signature. It was perfect. The loop of the R, the sharp angle of the C. It was a flawless forgery of my handwriting. Beside it was the signature of the company CFO, my daughter-in-law, Monica. My own flesh and blood had forged my name to gamble away my entire life savings. I pulled out my phone and dialed Brad's number. It rang 4 times and went straight to voicemail. I hung up and dialed again. Voicemail again. He was avoiding me. Or he was busy celebrating the fact that he just secured $4 million of someone else's money. I dialed Monica's number. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, Richard." Her voice floated through the speaker, breezy and careless. In the background, I could hear the rhythmic splashing of water and the upbeat tempo of a pop song playing over a stereo system. "Where are you?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Oh, we are taking a half day." She laughed. "Brad and I are down at the marina. We are actually looking at a few boats right now. The company is having a fantastic quarter, so we thought we might treat ourselves." "Did you need something?" "Boats." They were looking at luxury boats on a Tuesday morning, entirely funded by the blood and sweat of my entire adult life. A sickening wave of betrayal washed over me. This was the woman who sat at my Thanksgiving table, the woman who hugged Patricia and called her mom. And she had just helped my son sign away our future. "Nothing urgent," I replied smoothly, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were stark white. "I was just looking at the calendar. Patricia and I would love to have you both over for Sunday dinner. We have not had a good family meal in a while." "That sounds wonderful, Richard. We will be there at 6. Have a great day." She ended the call. I sat in the silent cab of my truck, staring out at the busy street. The betrayal was so profound, it almost felt unreal. My son did not just borrow money. He committed federal fraud. He put everything Patricia and I owned directly in the crosshairs of his own ambition. If his medical supply business defaulted on a massive $4 million loan, the bank would legally liquidate my entire portfolio to recover their funds. We would be left with absolutely nothing. We would lose the house. We would lose our security. I started the engine, but I did not drive home right away. I needed to think. Confronting them right now would be a massive mistake. If I marched into their office or down to that marina and started screaming about lawyers and police, they would know I was onto them. They had access to my accounts. They had my forged signature on file. If they panicked, they could drain the portfolio entirely and wire the money to an offshore account before I could even get a lawyer on the phone. No. I could not let them know that I knew. I had to go back to being the quiet, retired old man they thought I was. I had to play the part perfectly. I drove back to my house, parked in the driveway, and took a deep breath before walking through the front door. Patricia was sitting in the sunroom, looking out at the garden. She turned to me and smiled, her eyes warm and familiar. She asked me how my morning walk was. I told her it was fine. I did not tell her that our son had just stolen our future. I kissed her forehead, went into my home office, and locked the door. I pulled out my banking tokens, my tax documents, and a fresh legal pad. If my son and his wife wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception, they were going to learn a very painful lesson. They thought I was just a tired old man who did not understand modern finance. But they forgot that I spent my entire career anticipating disasters and building structures that could withstand any storm. They wanted to take everything from me. But by the time I was finished with them, they were going to lose far more than just money. I spent the next few days playing a very dangerous game of patience. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to drive over to Brad's office and demand answers. But I knew acting on anger would only give them the upper hand. Instead, I waited until Thursday evening to make my move. I picked up my phone and dialed his number. This time he answered almost immediately, his voice dripping with that manufactured warmth he used on his clients. He asked how I was doing, acting as though he had not just gambled away my entire life savings. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told him his mother and I missed seeing them around the house. I said I was grilling steaks this Sunday and expected them both to come over for dinner. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, probably wondering if I had an ulterior motive. But then he quickly agreed. He said they would not miss it for the world. When Sunday evening arrived, the Chicago air was thick and humid. I stood on the patio turning steaks on the grill, watching smoke rise into the darkening sky. Tires crunching on the gravel driveway announced their arrival. Brad and Monica stepped out of their luxury sedan looking like a picture from a magazine. Brad wore a crisp linen shirt, and Monica was dressed in designer clothes that easily cost more than my first truck. They walked into my home with bright smiles, carrying an expensive bottle of wine. Patricia greeted them warmly in the kitchen. My sweet wife had always loved having the house full of family. She hugged Brad tightly, unaware that the man holding her was plotting to destroy our security. I walked in, wiping my hands on a towel, and offered a welcoming smile. We sat down at the large oak dining table. The conversation was light and superficial. Brad talked about golf, and Monica complained about contractors remodeling their bathroom. I waited until we were halfway through the meal. I watched Brad cut into his steak, completely relaxed, confident in his own deception. I took a sip of my water, set my glass down, and looked directly at him. "I ran into Greg at the bank on Tuesday," I said casually. Brad paused. His knife hovered over his plate. He did not look up immediately. "Greg?" he asked. "The new branch manager," I replied. He was very enthusiastic. He congratulated me on your new $4 million commercial expansion loan. He also mentioned that my entire retirement portfolio was listed as the primary collateral. The dining room went completely silent. Patricia stopped eating and looked back and forth between us, confused. Monica froze her wine glass halfway to her lips. But Brad did not panic. He did not drop his knife. He did not sweat. Instead, he let out a loud, effortless laugh. He shook his head, put his knife down, and looked at me with amusement. "Dad, I swear those bank managers get more incompetent every single year," Brad said, chuckling as he picked up his wine glass. "I cannot believe Greg actually told you that nonsense today. He completely misunderstood the complex paperwork." I kept my face perfectly neutral. "Is that so?" I asked. "Yes," Brad replied smoothly, leaning forward as if sharing an inside joke. "When we applied for the commercial loan, underwriting needed a character reference from a senior guarantor to secure a much lower interest rate. I put your name down because your credit score is truly flawless. The actual collateral for the loan is our own house and the warehouse. The bank just ran your portfolio to verify my financial background standing. They did not encumber your assets at all. Greg is just an idiot reading the wrong line on the summary sheet. You know how those arrogant corporate guys are. They skim documents and immediately jump to conclusions. It was a brilliant lie. It was legally plausible, easily digestible, and delivered with perfect confidence." Before I could respond, Monica chimed in, seamlessly shifting the narrative to make them look like caring children. "Actually, Richard, we are so glad you brought up the banking stuff," Monica said, offering a warm, reassuring smile. "Brad and I have been meeting with our financial advisors lately, and we realized we really need to set up a living trust for you and Patricia. Illinois estate taxes are becoming brutal, and we want to make sure your assets are fully protected. We were going to surprise you with the finalized paperwork next week." As she spoke, Monica reached into her handbag and pulled out an amber bottle. She unscrewed the cap and tapped a white pill into her palm. She walked over to Patricia and poured a fresh glass of water. "Here you go, Mom," Monica said softly. "This is that new special multivitamin I ordered for you. The specialist said it will help with your energy levels and clear up that brain fog you complained about." Patricia smiled gratefully, taking the pill and washing it down with a large gulp of water. I watched the entire exchange. My mind was racing, connecting pieces, analyzing their flawless performance. I looked at Brad, then at Monica, and finally at my wife. I slowly nodded my head, letting out a long sigh, as if a great weight had been lifted off my shoulders. "Well," I said, managing a relieved smile, "that certainly makes a lot more sense. You really had me worried for a minute there, Brad. Next time, just give me a heads up before you use my name for a character reference." Brad laughed, raising his glass in a toast. "Lesson learned, Dad. I promise." The rest of the evening passed without incident. They played their parts perfectly, and I played mine. I was the trusting, slightly confused old father who was happy to have his successful son looking out for him. When they stood up to leave, we exchanged warm hugs at the door. I watched their taillights fade into the distance, my smile vanishing the second they were out of sight. I walked into the dining room to clear the table. Patricia had gone upstairs for bed. I noticed a small puddle of water on the floor near her chair. She must have spilled it when Monica handed her that pill. Our golden retriever, a gentle boy named Buster, ambled into the room. He sniffed the floor, found the spilled water, and eagerly lapped it up. I carried dishes to the sink and ran warm water. I heard Buster walk out into the hallway. I loaded the dishwasher, wondering how deep their deception really went. Then I heard a strange, choking sound coming from the living room. I dropped the sponge and hurried out of the kitchen. Buster was lying on his side near the sofa. His legs were twitching violently, scratching against the rug. His eyes were rolled back, showing whites, and thick, frothy white foam was bubbling out of his mouth. I dropped to my knees beside him, my heart hammering in my chest. He let out a low, agonizing whine, his chest heaving rapidly. I scooped Buster into my arms. He was a heavy dog, a solid 80 pounds, but adrenaline masked the weight. I carried him to my truck, laying him across the back seat so he would not hurt himself. Patricia was still upstairs, fast asleep and unaware of the nightmare unfolding. I left a hurried note on the kitchen counter telling her Buster had a sudden stomach ache and I was taking him to the emergency clinic. I did not want her panicking. The drive to the veterinary hospital felt like it took hours. The suburban roads were empty, the streetlights flashing over my windshield in a rhythmic blur. I kept reaching a hand back, feeling the rapid shallow rise and fall of his chest. When I pulled into the lit parking lot, I blared my horn twice. 2 technicians rushed out the front glass doors, pushing a metal gurney. They took one horrified look at his rolling eyes, his twitching limbs, and the thick foam bubbling around his muzzle. They did not hesitate, wheeling him rapidly through the double doors. I was left standing alone in this cold waiting room, staring blankly at my trembling hands. I sat heavily in a hard plastic chair for what felt like an absolute eternity. The digital clock on the wall ticked past midnight. My mind was racing, relentlessly replaying the entire evening on a continuous loop. The grilled steaks, the expensive wine, Brad smiling as he lied directly to my face, and Monica smoothly handing my vulnerable wife a pill. A pill she confidently claimed was merely a health vitamin. A pill that casually dissolved on the floor. Around 1 in the morning, a young veterinarian wearing green scrubs walked into the waiting room. She looked exhausted, but offered me a reassuring smile. She told me Buster was stable. They had successfully pumped his stomach, administered intravenous fluids, and given him activated charcoal to bind whatever dangerous toxin he had ingested. He was miraculously going to survive. I let out a long breath that I felt like I had been holding in my chest for over an hour. But then her facial expression shifted. She pulled out a clipboard and looked at me with genuine concern. "Richard, I have to ask you a very specific and serious medical question. Do you or your wife keep any heavy human-grade prescription sedatives or antipsychotic medications in your house? Something perhaps left out on a counter or accidentally dropped on the floor?" I shook my head immediately. "No," I replied, my voice hoarse. "Neither of us take anything stronger than a daily aspirin and some basic blood pressure medication formally prescribed by our cardiologist." "Why do you exactly ask?" She frowned deeply, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "The symptoms Buster presented tonight, the severe neurological depression, the violent tremors, the excessive frothing. They are not consistent with typical canine toxins like chocolate grapes or common household cleaners. This looks exactly like an accidental ingestion of a highly powerful central nervous system depressant." We sent a swab of his saliva and a sample of his stomach contents to an outside laboratory for a rush toxicology panel. "I just wanted to check if there was a known medication in your home so we could quickly administer a specific reversal agent." I told her firmly again that there was absolutely nothing like that in our home. She nodded, advised me to go home and get some rest, and said they would keep Buster under strict medical observation for the next 24 hours. She promised to call me the very second the laboratory results came back. I drove home in suffocating silence. The humid night air rushed through the open windows of my truck, but I felt completely cold and numb inside. I pulled into my driveway and walked slowly back into my quiet house. The warm lights were still glowing softly in the kitchen. The empty amber bottle Monica had casually left on the counter sat there, seemingly mocking me. I picked it up. The label was entirely generic. It simply read, Premium Vitality Complex, printed on a cheap sticker. There was no medical manufacturer listed, no clear list of ingredients, and no official seal of approval. I walked upstairs and stood silently in the doorway of our bedroom. Patricia was fast asleep, her breathing soft and even in the dim room. I watched her for a very long time. Over the last 3 months, my vibrant, incredibly sharp wife had started to slowly fade away. She would suddenly forget mid-sentence what we were actively talking about. She would accidentally leave the stove burning after cooking. She would sit heavily in her chair and stare out the window with a blank, vacant expression that absolutely broke my heart. We had recently visited our primary care doctor, who gently suggested it might simply be the early onset of cognitive decline. He said it was sadly common for people at our age. But as I stood there in the dark shadows of the hallway, connecting the scattered dots, a horrifying, crystal-clear realization washed over me. Her mental decline started exactly 3 months ago. That was the exact same week Monica had enthusiastically brought over the very first bottle of her special vitamins, boldly claiming her own mother took them with miraculous health results. My son and his wife were not just forging my signature to steal my life savings to fund their luxury lifestyle. They were deliberately and chemically altering my wife to make her docile and compliant. They were actively building a documented medical history of severe dementia. This would strictly ensure that if I ever tried to fight back against their financial fraud, they could quickly point to her rapidly deteriorating condition and easily claim I was losing my mind too. It was a cold, calculated, and methodical destruction of our personal autonomy. A sudden violent surge of panic gripped my body. If they were truly willing to secretly drug my innocent wife and boldly forge my signature on a $4 million commercial loan, what else had they illegally touched? What other secure financial accounts had they secretly compromised directly behind my back? I hurried down the hall to my home office. I desperately needed to access the federal tax portal. I carefully entered my username and password. A bright red error message quickly flashed across the screen. Incorrect password. My chest tightened painfully. I clicked the small link to quickly reset my secure password. The recovery email address partially displayed an email ending in @caldwellmedsupply.com. Monica had maliciously diverted all my federal communications. I was totally locked out. At exactly 8 in the morning, my cell phone rang loudly. It was the emergency vet. Richard Shee explained the laboratory just found highly concentrated traces of an antipsychotic drug called haloperidol in his system. Someone purposely brought it into your home. I politely thanked her, my voice completely and eerily calm, and ended the call. I looked directly at the fake amber bottle sitting on my desk. My own son's wife was actively and deliberately poisoning my innocent wife. The very next morning, I woke up before the sun cast its light over the Chicago suburbs. I walked down to the kitchen and stared at the amber bottle sitting on the counter. I could not simply throw the pills away. If Monica noticed they were missing, she would instantly know I was onto her. I had to be methodical. I emptied the toxic capsules into a plastic bag, sealed it, and hid it in my heavy steel toolbox in the garage. Then, I drove to the pharmacy and purchased a cheap bottle of over-the-counter digestive supplements that were the exact same size, shape, and chalky white color. I meticulously filled Monica's amber bottle with the harmless supplements and placed it right back on the kitchen island. When Patricia came downstairs for breakfast, I poured her a glass of orange juice and gently held her hands. I told her everything. I watched the confusion in her eyes morph into heartbreaking devastation as I explained what our own family was doing to us. We sat at the table and wept together. But we did not have the luxury of breaking down completely. We had a war to win. I told Patricia she had to keep taking the fake pills Monica provided, and more importantly, we both had to start playing our parts. If they wanted to build a narrative that we were losing our minds, we were going to give them an award-winning performance. Over the next few days, I began my act. When Brad called, I would intentionally pause in the middle of my sentences. I would ask him the same mundane questions 3 or 4 times. I started shuffling my feet when I walked, adopting a slight tremor in my hands when I held my coffee mug. It was a humiliating performance. Every time I faked a memory lapse, I could see the hidden gleam of triumph in Monica's eyes. She thought she was brilliant. She thought I was just a crumbling foundation she could easily demolish. By Wednesday, I knew I needed hard evidence of what they were actually doing with my forged signature and my stolen collateral. I drove to a popular Italian deli downtown and ordered 2 large trays of baked ziti and garlic bread. I carried the aluminum trays to my truck and drove straight to Caldwell Medical Supply. Brad's distribution center was located in a massive corporate park on the outskirts of the city. I parked my truck and walked slowly toward the glass entrance. I hunched my shoulders, painting a confused, vacant smile on my face. When I walked into the sleek reception area, the young receptionist immediately stood up. I held up the trays of pasta, my hands trembling, just enough to sell the illusion. "I brought lunch for my boy," I said, making my voice sound thin and reedy. I thought today was his birthday. I just wanted to surprise him. The receptionist gave me a look of deep pity. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. "Brad's birthday is not until October. But that is so sweet of you. Let me go find him. He is in the main conference room with a vendor right now." She stepped away from her desk, leaving the front lobby completely unattended. This was my narrow window of opportunity. I set the food trays down on the reception counter and slipped quietly down the main hallway. Having funded the initial startup costs for this very building, I knew the exact floor plan. I bypassed Brad's corner office and headed straight for the administrative wing. Monica's office was located at the end of the hall, adjacent to the primary corporate filing room. I peeked around the corner. Monica was standing down the opposite corridor, her back turned to me, aggressively whispering into her cell phone about shipping delays. She was completely distracted. I slipped silently into the filing room and gently closed the door behind me. The room was lined with tall metal cabinets and large wooden desks covered in open financial ledgers. I moved quickly and quietly. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and began flipping through the open binders on the central desk. My eyes scanned the complex spreadsheets, looking for anything tied to the $4 million loan. What I found was infinitely worse than a simple defaulted loan. The ledgers were filled with massive, repetitive billing invoices submitted directly to the federal Medicare program. The invoices claimed that Caldwell Medical Supply had delivered hundreds of motorized wheelchairs, high-end respiratory ventilators, and expensive orthopedic hospital beds to various residential addresses across the state. The payouts from the federal government were staggering. Millions of dollars were flowing into the company accounts every single month. But as I quickly photographed page after page of the billing records, a very specific set of delivery addresses caught my eye. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs. I recognized those addresses immediately. They were not residential care facilities or nursing homes. They were empty commercial dirt lots that my construction firm had purchased and subsequently sold over 15 years ago. Brad and Monica were not delivering any actual medical equipment. They were submitting completely fraudulent invoices to the federal government using ghost addresses they pulled from my old corporate property records. They were running a massive multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud syndicate. And because my forged signature was listed on the primary bank loan as the senior guarantor, the money was being laundered directly under the pristine umbrella of my immaculate financial history. If the federal authorities ever raided this building, the paper trail would point directly to me. I would spend the rest of my life in a federal prison. I opened another ledger, my hands trembling, not from my fake act, but from pure, unadulterated rage. The next page revealed a list of patients receiving these high-end motorized wheelchairs. I recognized 3 of the names. They were men who had worked on my roofing crews back in the late 80s, men who had long since passed away. Brad and Monica had somehow accessed my archived corporate employee records and were using the stolen identities of my deceased friends to bill the Medicare system. The depravity of it was almost incomprehensible. They weren't just stealing money. They were desecrating the memories of hardworking people to line their own pockets. I saw an invoice for a $70,000 respiratory ventilator, supposedly delivered to a man named Arthur Hayes. Arthur was my best foreman, had died of lung cancer in 2004. Yet according to Monica's meticulous, fraudulent accounting, Arthur was currently living in a dirt lot I sold 20 years ago, breathing through a machine paid for by the American taxpayers. The cold, calculated nature of their syndicate was staggering. They had weaponized my entire life's work, my credit, my properties, and even the identities of my former employees. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I had to brace my hands against the cold metal of the filing cabinet to keep my balance. This wasn't just a white-collar crime. It was a sprawling parasitic infection that had latched onto my legacy. I pulled my phone back out, my jaw set so tight my teeth ached. I photographed Arthur's fake invoice. I photographed the master spreadsheet. I made sure to capture the digital timestamps printed at the bottom of every page, proving that these files were actively being processed this very week. Every click of my camera's shutter felt like loading a bullet into a chamber. I kept snapping photographs, capturing every single routing number, every fake address, and every forged approval stamp. I had dozens of clear images saved to my phone. I carefully placed the last ledger back exactly where I found it. I turned around to leave, my heart hammering in my ears. The filing room door suddenly swung open. Monica stood in the doorway. The color instantly drained from her face. Her eyes darted from me to the financial ledgers on the desk. The silence in the small room was thick, suffocating, and incredibly dangerous. She took a slow step inside, her posture rigid. "Richard," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What exactly are you doing in here? This is a restricted area." I forced my face to go completely slack. I let my jaw hang slightly open and widened my eyes in a display of helpless panic. I clutched my hands together, letting them shake violently. "I am so sorry, Monica," I stammered. "I brought baked ziti for Brad's birthday party. I was trying to find the men's bathroom. The hallways here all look exactly the same. I am lost. Can you help me find the bathroom?" She glared at me with pure, undisguised contempt. "The bathroom is down the hall, Richard." I slowly shuffled past her, head bowed. Right behind me, she whispered to her assistant. "He is fading fast. We expedite the power of attorney by Friday." I shuffled down the long corporate hallway, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped. I could feel Monica staring daggers into my back as I walked toward the lobby. Every instinct urged me to turn around and confront her, to demand answers for the poison she was actively feeding my vulnerable wife. But I maintained my pathetic, broken facade. I found the men's bathroom, stepped inside, and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I walked over to the sink, gripped the cold porcelain edges, and stared at my own reflection in the mirror. I took several deep, shuddering breaths to calm the violent pounding in my chest, splashing cold water on my face to wash away the feeling of sheer panic. I had the photographic evidence firmly secured on my phone, but I was entirely out of my depth. I needed professional help. I pulled out my cell phone and scrolled through my contact list until I found a very specific name: Thomas. Thomas had been my primary certified public accountant for over 30 years. He had managed the complex books for my commercial construction firm since the very beginning, navigating confusing tax codes and massive payrolls with absolute integrity. 6 months ago, Brad and his wife Monica had abruptly forced him into early retirement, falsely claiming his traditional accounting methods were too outdated for a modern medical supply corporation. I dialed his number. He answered on the third ring, his voice sounding tired but genuinely surprised to hear from me. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed to see him immediately in person, and that it directly involved Brad's company. He hesitated for a long moment, then gave me an exact address for a small coffee shop on the south side of town. I hastily left the massive medical supply building, drove straight through the heavy afternoon traffic to the coffee shop, and found Thomas sitting alone in a quiet, dimly lit corner booth. He looked older, bearing a heavy weight on his shoulders that I had never noticed before. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him. Before I could even explain what I had found in the filing room, Thomas held up his hand to stop me. "Richard," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know exactly why you are here. I wanted to tell you months ago, but I had absolutely no concrete proof, and I knew how much you fiercely loved your son." I asked him what he meant. Thomas took a slow sip of his black coffee and looked around the room to make sure nobody was listening to our conversation. He explained that shortly after Monica took over as the chief financial officer, she began setting up a highly complex web of offshore corporate accounts. Thomas had flatly refused to sign off on a series of massive unexplained wire transfers. The money was supposedly going to overseas medical equipment manufacturers, but the corporate tax identification numbers were completely fake. When Thomas confronted Monica about the glaring discrepancies, she threatened to legally ruin his professional license, citing a series of accounting errors she had purposely fabricated in the computer system. She aggressively pushed him out and locked down the financial servers the very next day. I pulled my phone from my pocket and showed Thomas the photographs I had just taken in the filing room. I watched his eyes widen as he rapidly scrolled through the images of the massive Medicare billing invoices and the corresponding delivery addresses. He recognized the empty commercial dirt lots immediately. He placed my phone face down on the table and rubbed his temples in sheer disbelief. "This is not just aggressive corporate accounting," Richard Thomas said grimly. "This is a massive, highly coordinated federal crime. You cannot just go to the local police with this kind of sophisticated fraud. You need someone who deeply understands how federal financial syndicates operate. You need someone who can rapidly trace the hidden money before it completely disappears into an offshore account." Thomas slowly pulled a small weathered leather notebook from his front breast pocket and carefully wrote down a private phone number on a torn piece of paper. He slid it across the table to me. He told me the number belonged to Mitchell Reed. Mitchell was a former investigator for the Federal Bureau specifically assigned to their elite financial crimes unit for over 20 years. He had recently retired and opened an independent forensic auditing firm. Thomas promised to call Mitchell right now and personally vouch for my character. 2 hours later, I was sitting inside a bustling, brightly lit diner on the extreme edge of the city limits. The air smelled strongly of fried food and stale coffee. The loud clatter of silverware and the constant chatter of the crowded room provided the perfect acoustic cover for a highly sensitive conversation. Mitchell Reed slid into the vinyl booth across from me. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, wearing a faded denim jacket and possessing a pair of sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to meticulously analyze every single detail in the room. He did not bother with a polite introduction. He simply asked to see the physical evidence. I handed him my phone already opened to the digital gallery. Mitchell spent the next 20 minutes scrolling through the photographs in absolute silence. He occasionally zoomed in on specific bank routing numbers, federal billing codes, and authorized signature lines. He pulled a small, encrypted tablet from his leather messenger bag and began cross-referencing the data I had captured with a secure public records database. I sat there in the uncomfortable booth, drinking my bitter, lukewarm coffee, watching a seasoned federal investigator meticulously unravel the devastating reality of my own son's corrupt corporate empire. My stomach churned with a toxic mixture of profound grief and boiling, uncontrollable anger. I thought about Patricia sitting at home completely unaware that her own family was systematically trying to destroy her mind with heavy sedatives. Mitchell finally set my phone down. He folded his hands on the table and looked me directly in the eyes. His expression was entirely devoid of any pity, displaying only cold, hard facts. Richard Mitchell began, his voice perfectly steady despite the chaotic noise of the diner around us. Your son is not simply running a struggling medical distribution company. He has constructed a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud syndicate. They are routinely billing the federal government for top-tier medical equipment, generating massive financial payouts, and delivering absolutely nothing to those empty commercial lots you identified. I nodded slowly, bracing myself for the inevitable blow. I asked him how deep the legal liability went. I needed to know exactly how much danger Patricia and I were currently facing. Mitchell leaned forward, lowering his voice so only I could hear him. The fake billing invoices are terrible, but they are not your primary problem. The real issue is the structural foundation of the company itself. When your son secured that new $4 million commercial loan, he did not just use your retirement portfolio as passive collateral. He legally structured the entire corporate debt profile around your specific financial identity. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. I asked him to explain exactly what that meant for me and my wife. It means your forged signature is explicitly listed on the master corporate documents as the senior guarantor, Mitchell said grimly. From a strictly legal standpoint, Brad has meticulously insulated himself and his wife from the primary financial liability. They are maliciously using your pristine credit history and your massive retirement portfolio to legitimize a massive flow of dirty money. When the federal government inevitably flags these fraudulent Medicare payouts, the official paper trail will not point to Brad. The money laundering protocols will trace directly back to your secure accounts. The heavy diner mug shook violently in my hand. I placed it down carefully on the table, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Mitchell delivered the final crushing blow. If the federal authorities raid that medical supply building tomorrow morning, they will exclusively look at the legal hierarchy. Because your name and your forged signature are permanently positioned at the very top of the liability chain, you are legally the fall guy. Your son has deliberately engineered this entire operation so that when the syndicate eventually collapses, you are the exact one who will spend the rest of your life in a federal prison. I stared into the muddy depths of my coffee cup, the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner reflecting off the surface. For a brief agonizing moment, the image of Brad as a 7-year-old boy flashed through my mind. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle in our driveway, the way he laughed when he finally found his balance. I asked Mitchell, my voice barely a whisper, how a son could look his father in the eye and plot his absolute destruction. Mitchell leaned back against the vinyl booth and let out a heavy sigh. In my 20 years at the... Richard, I've seen this exact pathology more times than I can count, Mitchell said, his tone softening with a hardened kind of empathy. It's a specific breed of corporate sociopathy. To your son, you aren't a father anymore. You are simply an asset, a line item on a balance sheet. People like Brad and Monica start by making small ethical compromises. A padded expense report here, a minor tax loop there. But greed is a bottomless pit. Once they realize they can game the system, they stop seeing people as human beings. They only see stepping stones and obstacles. Your pristine financial record was a stepping stone. Your physical autonomy and your wife's mental health were obstacles. They didn't target you because they hate you, Richard. They targeted you because you were convenient and they believed you were too weak to fight back. His words were a bitter pill, but they were the exact medicine I needed to hear. It completely stripped away any lingering guilt I felt about what I was about to do. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about survival. So how do we dismantle them? I asked, lifting my head and meeting Mitchell's sharp gaze. How do we tear this whole thing down without getting buried in the rubble? Mitchell's lips curved into a tight, predatory smile. That's the part where we turn their arrogance into our greatest weapon, he replied, opening a secure digital map on his tablet. I needed irrefutable proof. Mitchell had made it perfectly clear that my photographs of their fraudulent ledgers were only the beginning. To completely sever my legal liability from my son's massive criminal syndicate, I needed a recorded confession. I needed them to admit their intentions out loud. The very next morning, I booked Patricia a luxurious all-day spa package at a high-end resort downtown. I told her she desperately needed a day of pampering to help clear her mind. She understood the unspoken message. She kissed my cheek, grabbed her purse, and drove away, giving me the empty house I required. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I went to work. I drove to a specialized electronics store 2 towns over and purchased 3 high-definition, motion-activated hidden cameras. They were incredibly small, seamlessly disguised as ordinary household objects. I placed the first camera, which looked exactly like a standard phone charger, on the kitchen island. I positioned the second camera inside a fake smoke detector in the corner of the living room, angling the lens to capture the entire seating area. The third and most important camera went directly into my private study. I embedded it discreetly inside the spine of a thick, hollowed-out dictionary, sitting on the bookshelf directly behind my desk. I spent 2 hours meticulously testing the audio and video feeds on my encrypted tablet. The picture quality was stunningly clear, and the microphones picked up even the faintest whispers. With the trap fully set, I picked up my phone and called Brad. I kept my voice weak, slightly breathless, and deliberately unfocused. I told him I was feeling incredibly tired and confused today, but I still wanted to see them for a quick evening visit. I asked if they could bring over some takeout dinner because I simply did not have the energy to cook. Brad agreed instantly, his voice dripping with that same predatory warmth. They arrived at 6 in the evening, carrying a large bag of Italian food. I met them at the door, wearing an oversized cardigan and comfortable slippers. I forced my hands to shake as I took the food from Brad. Monica immediately walked into the kitchen, loudly offering to plate the food and pour the drinks. I knew exactly what she was doing. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she subtly slipped her hand into her purse, ready to poison my wife again. I had already replaced the toxic pills with digestive supplements, so I let her play her wicked game. We ate dinner in the living room. I barely touched my food. I slurred my words, repeated my sentences, and complained about a deep, heavy fog settling over my brain. Brad and Monica exchanged knowing, triumphant glances across the coffee table. After 20 minutes, I let out a long, dramatic yawn. I told them I was simply too exhausted to keep my eyes open. I slowly shuffled over to my large leather recliner in the corner of the living room, pulled a thick woven blanket up to my chin, and closed my eyes. I slowed my breathing, making my chest rise and fall in a deep, rhythmic pattern. Within 5 minutes, I was putting on the most convincing performance of a deep sleep imaginable. I lay there in the quiet room, every muscle in my body completely tense, listening intently. The sound of their casual conversation immediately dropped to a sharp, urgent whisper. I heard the distinct rustle of clothing as they stood up from the sofa. Brad whispered to Monica, telling her to check the kitchen drawers first, while he went into the study to locate my primary banking tokens. I heard their footsteps separate. Brad walked directly down the hallway and pushed open the heavy oak door to my private office. I remained completely motionless in my recliner. I waited for what felt like hours, listening to the muffled sounds of file cabinets opening and desk drawers sliding on their metal tracks. Eventually, they gathered back in the living room, quietly discussing their findings. They left the house shortly after, gently clicking the front door shut behind them so they would not wake the sleeping old man. When Patricia returned home later that night, I locked the front door and pulled the encrypted tablet from my safe. We sat close together on the edge of our bed, the only light in the room coming from the glowing screen. I accessed the hidden camera in my study and hit play. The video feed showed Brad aggressively rummaging through my mahogany desk. Monica walked into the frame a moment later, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She asked him if he had found the secondary account passwords. Brad shook his head, holding up my primary checkbook. The audio was perfectly crisp. I turned the volume up. Monica leaned against the bookshelf, staring coldly at my empty chair. She asked Brad if the timeline was still secure. Brad smiled, a greedy, terrifying smirk that completely twisted his familiar features into something monstrous. He looked directly at Monica and detailed their entire sickening plan. Once the $1.5 million from the feds clears his account on Friday, we pull his $2.8 million pension out too, Brad whispered, his voice echoing in the quiet bedroom. We transfer everything to the Cayman account, and we put them both in the state care facility by Monday morning. The haloperidol is working perfectly. He will not even know his own name by the time the federal agents figure out what happened. I sat completely frozen on the edge of the mattress. Patricia gasped and covered her mouth with her trembling hands, hot tears streaming freely down her pale cheeks. The monstrous reality of their dark conversation washed over me like freezing water. They were not just going to brutally rob us of all our hard-earned life savings. They were actively planning to institutionalize us against our will in a miserable state-run care facility. They were methodically planning to completely frame me for their massive federal Medicare fraud. And then, once the government discovered the forged invoices and the missing millions, my son and his wicked wife were going to quickly flee the country and casually live like wealthy royalty on a tropical island. I stared blankly at the paused digital video screen. The sheer cruelty was absolutely suffocating. I wrapped my arms tightly around my sobbing wife, holding her very close to my chest in the dark room. I slowly looked down at my watch. The massive offshore wire transfer was officially scheduled to automatically process early Friday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. I only had 48 short hours left to completely dismantle my son's entire life. If I made one single error, Patricia and I would lose our home, our remaining money, and our personal freedom. I pulled out my phone and sent a secure message to Mitchell. The trap was ready. I knew I could not afford to fail my beloved family now. It was time to finally strike back against them. The following morning was Wednesday. The heavy gray sky over Chicago mirrored the absolute resolve settling inside my chest. I did not confront my son. I did not call him to demand an explanation for the reality I had witnessed on that camera footage. Confrontation is a luxury for those who have nothing left to lose, and I had $2.8 million and my wife's safety on the line. I told Patricia to stay inside, lock the doors, and completely ignore her phone. I promised her that this nightmare would be over very soon. I got into my truck and drove to a discreet, unmarked brick building nestled in an industrial park on the west side of the city. Mitchell Reed had arranged a highly confidential meeting, and I knew my entire future depended on what happened inside those walls. When I walked into the sterile, windowless conference room, Mitchell was already seated at a long metal table. Beside him sat two sharp-looking federal prosecutors from the Department of Justice. They wore dark tailored suits and possessed the kind of intense, calculating demeanor that told me they had taken down men far more dangerous than my son. Mitchell introduced them simply as Agent Harris and Agent Vance. I sat across from them, folding my hands tightly to hide their slight trembling. I pushed my encrypted tablet forward, giving them unrestricted access to the video and audio recordings I had captured the night before. The agents watched the footage in complete silence. They listened to my own son coldly detail his plan to steal my life savings, launder his fraudulent federal money through my compromised bank accounts, and commit us both to a state-run mental facility. When the video ended, a heavy silence filled the room. Agent Harris slowly closed the tablet. He looked at me with a deep professional respect. He told me that my documentation was flawless. He confirmed that they had enough preliminary evidence to build a substantial case, but we faced a very serious tactical problem. I asked them what this tactical problem was. I suggested that I should just call my bank right now, completely close my retirement accounts, and block the forged commercial loan. I thought freezing the money would instantly stop their operation. But Mitchell firmly shook his head. If you close that account today, Brad will receive an automated alert within minutes. Mitchell explained, his voice low and urgent. The very second he realizes his primary financial conduit is blocked, he will know you discovered the fraud. He and Monica will immediately panic. They will electronically shred their corporate server's wire, whatever stolen money they currently hold, into untraceable offshore accounts, and flee the country before we can secure a federal arrest warrant. We cannot just spook them. We need to catch them entirely red-handed. We need to let them execute the massive federal wire transfer through your account, so we can freeze the money mid-air and trap them with undeniable proof of active money laundering. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. They were asking me to willingly leave my life savings exposed to a multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate. I told them that was an unacceptable risk. If my son managed to complete his planned transfer on Friday morning, my $2.8 million would vanish into a black hole in the Cayman Islands. That is exactly where the False Claims Act comes into play. Agent Vance interjected, sliding a thick, legally binding document across the table toward me. He explained that the federal government heavily relies on inside informants to take down massive Medicare fraud rings. Because I had brought them the internal evidence and was willing to facilitate the sting operation, they were officially designating me as a federal whistleblower. Agent Vance detailed the terms of the agreement. If I agreed to act as the bait and allow the federal authorities to monitor the fraudulent transfer in real time, the Department of Justice would grant me absolute blanket immunity from any charges related to the forged loan documents. I would be completely cleared of all legal liability. But the plan went far beyond mere protection. Mitchell explained the financial mechanics of the whistleblower statute. By law, private citizens who successfully help the government recover stolen federal funds are entitled to a massive percentage of the recovered money. If we execute this trap flawlessly, Mitchell said, looking me directly in the eyes, you will not just save your retirement fund. The government will reward you with up to 25% of every single dollar we seize from your son's criminal operation. This is your chance to completely destroy their syndicate and walk away with your financial security multiplied. I stared at the thick legal document resting on the table. The sheer magnitude of the situation was almost impossible to process. My son had methodically planned to leave me rotting in a mental institution while he lived on a tropical island with my money. Now the federal government was offering me the ultimate counterstrike. I picked up the pen and signed my name at the bottom of the whistleblower agreement, legally binding myself to the dangerous sting operation. Agent Harris quickly outlined the precise mechanics of the trap. We could not rely on the bank's standard fraud department to intercept the money. Corporate banking systems were too slow and heavily automated. We needed a precise mechanical trigger that would instantly flag the transfer the very second it hit my account. Mitchell had formulated a brilliant, highly technical maneuver to create that exact trigger, but it required me to take complete control of my own financial portfolio in the middle of the night. I had to open a brand new, highly secure federal safe account that only I and the federal agents could monitor. Then I had to manually transfer almost the entirety of my own retirement funds into that safe account, leaving behind a very specific, carefully calculated remnant of cash in the compromised account. This delicate financial maneuver would force the bank's automated security software to instantly flag any incoming massive deposits from my son's fraudulent Medicare payouts. The catch was the timing. I could not execute the maneuver today or tomorrow. If I moved the money too early, Monica's aggressive accounting software would detect the missing collateral and alert them that the trap was set. I had to wait until the absolute last possible moment. I had to execute the transfer in the dead of night, just hours before their stolen money was scheduled to hit. I stood up from the metal table, shaking hands with the two federal agents. I walked out of the sterile building and stepped back into the cold Chicago air. My mind was racing with the complex instructions Mitchell had given me. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. I had exactly 48 hours to execute a highly risky financial maneuver that required timing down to the final second. If I fail this maneuver on Thursday night, I will lose my $2.8 million absolutely forever. The drive back to my suburban home was the longest commute of my life. The skyscrapers of Chicago gave way to the familiar streets of my neighborhood. Every passing car seemed to amplify the crushing weight resting on my chest. When I walked through the front door, the silence felt deeply oppressive. Patricia was sitting quietly at the kitchen table, holding a warm mug of herbal tea. I sat down and explained the sheer gravity of the situation. I told her the federal agents were going to help us, but we had to play a terrifying game of waiting. We had to sit completely still and allow our son, Uchon, to believe he had successfully outsmarted us. The next 36 hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. I spent Wednesday evening and all of Thursday pacing the floors of my study. I could not focus on reading. I could not watch television. The magnitude of what was approaching consumed my every waking thought. By Thursday night, a heavy blanket of darkness had settled over our home. Patricia had gone upstairs to sleep. I was sitting alone in the dim living room when my cell phone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table. The buzzing made my heart jump. I picked up the phone. It was a text message from Brad. "Hey Dad, just checking in on you. You seemed a little out of it when we came over on Sunday. Monica and I are just worried about you. Are you feeling okay? Let us know if you need us to come by and help with anything. We love you." His message was sickening. He was meticulously laying down the digital groundwork for his upcoming narrative. He was creating a documented paper trail of his deep concern for his mentally declining father, putting his fake compassion in writing so he could easily produce these messages to authorities as proof of his devotion. My stomach twisted with disgust. I stared at the screen, calculating my exact response. I knew I had to maintain the fragile illusion that his toxic plan was working perfectly. I had to convince him we were entirely helpless. I typed out a deliberate, clumsy response. I intentionally turned off the automatic spelling correction feature on my phone. "Hi, Brad. Thank you, son. Just very tired today. Head is foggy again. Patricia is sleeping. We are okay. Maybe see you next week." I hit send and tossed the phone back onto the table. I felt physically dirty playing his wicked game, but I knew the ultimate payoff would make this temporary humiliation worthwhile. He did not reply. He had the digital evidence he needed. He was likely sitting in his luxury home right now, confidently finalizing his financial transfer, completely unaware that a federal snare was tightening. At midnight, I walked into the dark kitchen and turned on a single lamp. The house was silent, save for the humming refrigerator. I set my laptop on the granite island and opened the screen. Mitchell had given me a highly encrypted flash drive during our secure meeting. I inserted the drive. A series of black screens flashed rapidly before a clean banking portal materialized. It did not display any bank logos. It simply asked for an access code. I typed in the sequence. I was instantly granted access to an untraceable federal holding account. I pulled up my personal Chase Bank portal on a separate tab. My $2.8 million retirement portfolio was sitting right there intact. It was a lot of numbers on a glowing screen. My chest tightened with profound anxiety. The rules Mitchell had laid out were absolutely rigid. I had to execute the massive wire transfer into the federal holding account at exactly 3 in the morning. The timing was the most critical component of the operation. If I moved the money right now, Monica's automated accounting software would instantly ping her cell phone with an alert. She would see that the primary collateral for their loan had vanished. She and Brad would immediately panic, pull the plug on their fraudulent transfer, and flee the jurisdiction before the agents could secure the arrest warrants. I would ruin the criminal investigation. But if I waited too long, their malicious automated sweep protocol would aggressively pull my entire life savings into their offshore account. I was sitting on a razor-thin wire balancing the fate of my family against the ticking digital clock. I sat in the cold kitchen, staring relentlessly at the bright numbers. 1 o'clock came and went. The heavy silence of the house grew heavier. I thought about the first home I had ever built with my own 2 hands. I thought about the proud look on Patricia's face when we finally paid off our mortgage. I thought about the day Brad was born and the immense love I had felt for the tiny boy holding my finger. The grief of losing my son was a physical ache in my bones, but the fierce need to protect my wife completely overpowered it. 2 o'clock slowly ticked by. I nervously rubbed my face, my eyes burning from staring at the bright monitor. I refreshed my bank portal to ensure my secure session had not timed out. The numbers remained steady. I pulled up the transfer screen and typed in the exact routing digits for the federal holding account. I entered the precise transfer amount, $2,799,902. I left exactly $98 resting in the primary balance box, preparing the automated tripwire that would flag his incoming federal funds. I hovered my finger over the enter key. My heart was thumping wildly. It was 2:45 in the morning. 15 agonizing minutes remaining. I took a deep breath and stared at the glowing numbers. 250. The heavy tension in the quiet kitchen was suffocating. I wiped a cold bead of sweat from my forehead. 253. I moved my mouse cursor directly over the bright blue confirmation button. I just needed 2 more minutes of perfect silence to finally execute the plan. At exactly 2:55 in the morning, the bright screen suddenly flickered. The familiar layout of my personal banking portal abruptly vanished. The screen instantly turned a stark, solid gray. A small spinning wheel appeared in the center of the monitor, followed rapidly by a bold, bright red text box. System error. Scheduled server maintenance in progress. Access temporarily denied. Please contact your local branch administrator. My blood ran completely cold. I frantically clicked the refresh button. The gray maintenance screen remained absolutely frozen in place. I slammed my hand against the granite countertop in sheer panic. Had Monica manually locked me out of the system? Had they initiated their offshore transfer early to bypass my security? I was sweating bullets, staring helplessly at the glowing error message. The digital clock cruelly ticked to 2:56. The digital clock on the corner of my monitor shifted from 2:59 to 3 o'clock in the morning. The gray screen remained frozen. I felt the precious seconds slipping through my fingers. If Monica had detected my login attempt and triggered a manual override, everything was ruined. I would be locked out of my own financial life forever, totally powerless to stop my son from destroying my legacy. My heart hammered so violently against my ribs, I pressed the refresh key again. Nothing happened. The terrible silence of the kitchen seemed to close in around me, amplifying the sound of my own ragged breathing. I waited 1 more agonizing minute. I clicked the small circular arrow on my browser. At exactly 3:02 in the morning, the heavy gray screen suddenly blinked. The error message vanished. The familiar bright interface of my personal banking portal materialized in front of me. I let out a sharp, trembling breath. I was back in. I did not waste a single second. My hands moved across the keyboard with a frantic, practiced precision. I quickly navigated back to the primary transfer menu. I selected the secure, untraceable federal holding account that Mitchell had established for me. Then I moved to the amount box. I stared at my total life savings, $2,800,000. I carefully typed in the specific digits I had rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times over the last 48 hours. 2799902.00, $2,799,902. I checked the numbers 3 separate times. I verified the federal routing sequence digit by digit. I could not afford a single typographical error. My breathing was harsh and ragged in the suffocating silence of the dark kitchen. I took one final grounding breath, centering myself in the quiet reality of my kitchen. I moved the cursor over the confirmation button and pressed down firmly on the mouse. The screen loaded for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a bright green checkmark appeared. The transfer was successfully executed. My money was completely safe, locked away behind an impenetrable wall of federal security. I looked at the remaining balance displayed in bold black numbers at the top of the screen, $98. I had intentionally and meticulously left exactly $98 resting in my primary checking account. To anyone else, it might have looked like a simple mathematical error, a foolish miscalculation made by a confused old man in the middle of the night. But it was not an error. It was the most lethal component of the entire federal sting operation. Mitchell had spent over an hour explaining this specific vulnerability in the modern banking architecture. Criminal syndicates rely heavily on the predictable nature of automated financial software. They exploit the algorithms that process millions of daily transactions without any human oversight. To catch them, you have to break the algorithm. During our highly confidential meeting at the secure facility, Mitchell had explicitly warned me against completely draining the account down to zero. I explained that if I simply closed the portfolio or brought the balance to a zero state, Monica's aggressive accounting software would immediately register the account as fully terminated. She and Brad would instantly abort their fraudulent transfer and vanish into the wind before the sun even rose over Chicago. But $98 kept the account technically open while activating a completely invisible, highly restrictive banking tripwire. Mitchell had explained the precise mechanical architecture of modern financial institutions. Standard commercial bank accounts, including my specific tier at Chase Bank, maintain a strict $100 minimum operating threshold. When an active account suddenly drops below that specific $100 mark, the bank does not automatically close it. Instead, the central banking algorithm silently reclassifies the account into a restricted low balance status. This invisible status change is a fundamental security protocol designed to prevent massive overdrafts. But Mitchell had figured out how to weaponize this protocol directly against my son's criminal syndicate. Brad had scheduled a massive fraudulent federal wire transfer of $1.5 million to pass directly through my compromised account at 8 o'clock in the morning. He fully expected my massive retirement funds to act as a financial buffer, providing the necessary institutional credibility to seamlessly process the dirty Medicare money. But he did not know about the $98. When Brad's automated wire attempts to force $1.5 million of stolen federal money into an account containing only $98, the banking software will not just reject the transaction. The massive glaring discrepancy between the restricted low balance status and the astronomical incoming wire will trigger an immediate catastrophic systemic alarm. The bank's security architecture will automatically generate a highly urgent suspicious activity report, funneling the data directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, universally known as FinCEN. Mitchell promised me that the very second the FinCEN algorithm detects that specific suspicious activity report, the trap will snap completely shut. The federal network will instantly freeze the $1.5 million in mid-air, trapping the funds in a secure digital purgatory. The money will never reach the Cayman Islands. It will never touch my son's offshore corporate accounts. Instead, the frozen transfer will immediately alert the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice, providing them with the exact digital coordinates, the fraudulent routing numbers, and the undeniable, irrefutable proof of active money laundering. I had successfully transformed my own compromised financial portfolio into a federal bear trap. I stared at the bright computer monitor, watching the $98 balance gleam in the dim kitchen light. It felt incredibly strange to look at a number so small, knowing it wielded enough destructive power to completely dismantle a multi-million-dollar criminal empire. I had successfully severed my legal liability. I had protected Patricia. I had secured our entire future. I slowly reached out and closed my laptop, the quiet click echoing loudly in the stillness of the house. The bright glow of the screen vanished, leaving me alone in the shadows of my kitchen. I looked up at the digital clock glowing softly on the microwave panel. It was exactly 4 o'clock in the morning. The hardest part of the operation was officially over, but the most dangerous confrontation was still rapidly approaching. I stood up from the granite island, my legs feeling stiff and heavy from the immense adrenaline crash. I walked over to the coffee maker, my hands moving through the familiar, comforting routine. I filled the glass carafe with fresh water, scooped dark roasted grounds into the filter, and pressed the brewing button. The machine began to hum and hiss, filling the quiet room with the rich, bold scent of black coffee. I poured myself a large, steaming mug. I did not add any cream or sugar. I needed the bitter, biting heat to keep my senses absolutely sharp. I carried the heavy ceramic mug out of the kitchen and walked slowly into the front living room. I bypassed my comfortable leather recliner. Instead, I pulled a straight-backed wooden dining chair directly into the center of the room. I sat down heavily, gripping the hot mug in both of my hands. I positioned the chair so that I was directly facing the heavy oak front door of my home. Beyond that thick wooden barrier, the dark suburban streets of Chicago were completely silent. But I knew the silence would not last. The digital clock continued to tick mercilessly toward the morning. The trap was set. The bait was resting perfectly in place. The wait begins. I took a slow sip of the black coffee, letting the bitter heat ground me in the present moment. I was no longer the confused, shuffling old man they thought I was. I was entirely ready for war. The hours between 4 and 6 in the morning stretched out with an agonizing physical wait. I sat perfectly still in the wooden dining chair, my eyes locked on the heavy oak front door. The black coffee in my mug turned ice cold, but I did not pour a fresh cup. I could not risk breaking my focus. Outside my front window, the deep blackness of the night began to surrender to a pale shade of gray. Dawn was finally breaking over the quiet Chicago suburbs. The familiar silhouettes of the oak trees gradually emerged from the shadows. The neighborhood was completely silent. Blissfully unaware of the federal trap actively ticking down inside my living room. At 6 o'clock, I heard the soft creak of the wooden staircase behind me. I did not turn around immediately. I listened to the gentle footsteps crossing the hardwood floor. Patricia walked slowly into the living room, wrapping a thick knitted shawl tightly around her shoulders against the early morning chill. She had been completely off Monica's toxic pills for an entire week now. The hazy, vacant stare that had clouded her eyes for 3 months was completely gone. She was fully lucid, sharp, and fiercely present. She pulled a second wooden chair next to mine and sat down silently. She reached out and took my rough, calloused hand in hers, interlacing our fingers with a firm, steady grip. We did not need to exchange any words. We both understood the devastating gravity of what was about to happen. We were sitting together in the quiet calm of the eye of the storm, bracing ourselves for the inevitable impact. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to echo loudly against the walls. 6:15, 6:30. Morning light slowly spilled across the living room floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I kept my phone resting face up on my lap, the dark screen feeling like a live grenade waiting to detonate. I knew the automated banking systems processed massive federal wire transfers in sequential batches, usually clearing the holding queues just before standard corporate business hours began. My son was likely sitting in his luxury home right now, confidently drinking his morning coffee, fully expecting his stolen $1.5 million to seamlessly wash through my pristine financial portfolio. I tightened my grip on Patricia's hand. At exactly 6:45 in the morning, the heavy silence of the room was violently shattered. My cell phone buzzed sharply against my leg. The sudden noise made both of us flinch. I slowly picked up the device, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The screen illuminated, displaying a stark automated text message directly from the centralized fraud detection system at Chase Bank. I read the glowing words 3 times to ensure my exhausted eyes were not deceiving me. The text read, "Urgent notification. Incoming federal wire transfer of $1,500,000 has been automatically flagged and suspended for mandatory manual review due to restricted account threshold status. Please contact the Federal Compliance Department immediately." The brilliant, desperate trap had snapped completely shut. I let out a ragged breath, dropping the heavy phone onto my lap. Mitchell Reed's invisible tripwire had functioned with absolute devastating perfection. Brad's massive injection of stolen Medicare funds had collided violently with my meticulously engineered $98 account balance. The sheer mathematical impossibility of the transaction had instantly triggered the FinCEN security algorithms. The money was now frozen entirely mid-air, suspended in a secure digital vault that my son could never possibly access. At this exact moment, automated digital alarms were actively going off inside the Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service. Highly trained federal agents were rapidly tracing the fraudulent routing numbers directly back to Caldwell Medical Supply. I turned my head and looked at Patricia. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye and traced a silent path down her cheek. She offered me a small, brave nod of confirmation. We had successfully executed the most dangerous financial maneuver of our lives. I had absolutely secured my $2.8 million retirement portfolio behind an impenetrable federal wall. I had protected my innocent wife from being chemically poisoned and wrongfully institutionalized. But the emotional cost of our victory was incredibly high. The automated text message on my phone was not just a banking notification. It was the absolute, undeniable confirmation that the boy I had raised, the son I had loved and supported for 42 years, had truly and deliberately tried to completely destroy our lives. The profound grief of that realization was a heavy, suffocating anchor in my chest. But there was no time left for sorrow. If I had received the automated alert of the frozen transfer, I knew with absolute certainty that the sending account had received a catastrophic error notification as well. Monica was the chief financial officer. She would be actively monitoring the outgoing wire. When the transfer abruptly bounced back with a severe compliance warning, she would instantly realize something had gone wrong. She would see the restricted status of my account and know the primary financial conduit for their criminal syndicate was completely blocked. Panic would set in. They would not call to politely ask what happened. They would come directly to the source to force a manual override. I watched the digital clock on my phone switch to 6:50. I stood up from the chair and asked Patricia to step back into the kitchen. I did not want her in the line of fire when the front door opened. I walked over to the front window and stood slightly to the side of the heavy curtains, peering out at the quiet street. The neighborhood was waking up. A delivery truck rumbled past the corner intersection. The normalcy of the outside world felt bizarre and disconnected from the intense confrontation building inside my home. I checked my phone one last time. 6:55. I slid the device into my pocket and squared my shoulders. I rolled my neck, releasing the tight, coiled tension in my muscles. I was not a frail, confused old man, and I was absolutely done playing that humiliating part. At exactly 6:58 in the morning, the harsh sound of screeching rubber shattered the peaceful suburban morning. A black SUV tore around this corner of my street, moving at a dangerously reckless speed. The vehicle swerved sharply, the tires biting aggressively into the concrete curb as it slammed violently into my driveway. The vehicle jerked to a sudden halt, throwing gravel across the manicured lawn. Before the engine turned off, the driver's side door was kicked open. I watched through the narrow gap in the curtains as Brad threw himself out of the vehicle. His face was flushed red, his eyes wide and frantic. Monica scrambled out the passenger side a second later, clutching her cell phone like a weapon. They sprinted wildly up my walkway, their their heavy footsteps echoing like gunshots in the morning air. The storm had finally arrived at my front door. The violent pounding on the heavy oak wood began exactly as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. It was not a desperate knock for help. It was a vicious, aggressive assault on the physical barrier of my home. The thick wooden doorframe actually shuddered and groaned under the immense force of the blows. The heavy brass knocker clattered uselessly as clenched fists hammered against the stained glass panels. The sheer violence of the noise echoed through the quiet suburban house, shattering the peaceful morning silence. I stood perfectly still for a brief moment, taking one final deep breath to anchor myself. I glanced back toward the kitchen to ensure Patricia was safely positioned behind the granite island, completely out of the direct line of sight. She offered me a single resolute nod. I turned back toward the entryway, deliberately slumping my shoulders and adopting the frail, confused posture they expected to see. I slowly reached out my hand, trembling just slightly, and turned the heavy deadbolt. I barely had the chance to pull the handle backward before the door was violently shoved open from the outside. The heavy wood crashed painfully against the interior wall, chipping the plaster. Brad burst into the foyer like a wild, cornered animal. His appearance was deeply shocking. The usually immaculate, perfectly groomed corporate executive was completely gone. His expensive designer shirt was wrinkled and completely soaked with dark patches of sweat. His tie hung loosely around his neck, haphazardly pulled to the side. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darting frantically around the quiet room. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps as if he had just sprinted a mile. Monica was right behind him, pushing her way through the entryway with equal desperation. Her hair was completely disheveled, falling in messy strands across her pale, terrified face. She was practically hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she clutched a heavy leather tote bag against her side. She did not even look at me. Her eyes immediately locked onto the hallway leading toward my private study and the open kitchen area. Before I could even speak a single word of greeting, Brad closed the distance between us. He did not ask how I was. He did not check to see if his elderly father was frightened by the violent intrusion. He lunged forward and aggressively grabbed me by the thick woolen collar of my morning robe. He bunched the heavy fabric tightly in his fists, twisting the material until it bit sharply into the back of my neck. He physically slammed me backward against the hallway wall. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs, but I forced my facial expression to remain entirely blank and confused. "What did you do?" Brad screamed directly into my face, his voice cracking with a high-pitched manic panic. Tiny flecks of spit flew from his lips and hit my cheek. "Where is it? Where is the $2.8 million?" I let my jaw drop slightly, blinking my eyes in a rapid, exaggerated display of elderly bewilderment. "Brad," I stammered, making my voice sound incredibly weak and pathetic. "Brad, what are you talking about? You are hurting me. Why are you yelling?" "Do not play stupid with me," he roared violently, shaking me by the collar. My head snapped back against the drywall. The transfer bounced. "Our $1.5 million wire is completely frozen in the federal compliance queue. The bank system is saying your primary account only holds $98. Where did you move the collateral? You are ruining my life. You are ruining everything." The sheer entitlement radiating from his desperate screams was absolutely nauseating. He was actively accusing me of ruining his life because I had dared to move my own hard-earned life savings out of his criminal reach. He was furiously demanding to know why I had not simply laid down and allowed him to systematically destroy my financial future. While Brad held me pinned against the entryway wall, Monica completely lost whatever fragile grip on reality she still possessed. She entirely ignored the physical assault happening right next to her. She sprinted past us, her high heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor, and rushed directly into the kitchen. I could hear the immediate chaotic sounds of absolute destruction. She began tearing frantically through the kitchen, the loud crash of heavy wooden drawers being pulled out and dumped directly onto the tile floor echoed through the house. "Find the banking tokens!" Monica shrieked hysterically from the kitchen, her voice reaching a shrill, piercing pitch that barely sounded human. Find his checkbooks. Find the digital security keys. We have to initiate a manual override right now. I listened to the sound of silverware crashing against the floorboards. I heard the distinct tearing of paper as she aggressively ripped through the organized folders I kept on the kitchen desk. She was destroying our home in a blind, desperate search for anything that could restore their broken criminal conduit. Monica screamed, her voice cracking with pure terror. If that $1.5 million does not clear the laundering protocol by noon, today, the federal investigators are going to seize the corporate servers. The IRS is going to audit the entire distribution network. The private backers who fronted the offshore cash are going to absolutely kill us. Find his passwords. Make him log into the portal right now. The gravity of her hysterical confession hung heavily in the air. She was openly screaming about federal audits, money laundering protocols, and dangerous private backers right in the middle of my kitchen. They were completely unraveling, entirely consumed by the terrifying realization that their massive syndicate was collapsing around them. They thought they had perfectly insulated themselves from the criminal fallout, but my $98 tripwire had successfully paralyzed their entire operation. Brad's grip on my collar tightened painfully. He leaned in closer, his breathing ragged and sour. He was trembling from head to toe, completely consumed by the adrenaline of his own catastrophic failure. He truly believed that the heavy doses of haloperidol had rendered me a helpless, compliant old man. He thought I was just a confused, medicated victim who had accidentally triggered a banking error in a moment of dementia-induced panic. "Listen to me, you old fool," Brad growled, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "I need you to focus your damaged brain right now. I need the new account numbers. I need the digital transfer passwords. You are going to walk into your study, you are going to sit at your computer, and you are going to reverse whatever stupid mistake you made last night. Do you understand me? You are going to fix this right now." He aggressively shook me again, the heavy woolen fabric of my robe straining under his desperate grip. He glared into my eyes, searching for the hazy, compliant confusion he had grown so accustomed to seeing over the last 3 months. He fully expected me to cower in fear. He fully expected me to weep, to apologize, and to immediately surrender whatever passwords he demanded just to make the terrifying shouting stop. I stood there, pinned firmly against the hallway wall of the house I had built with my own 2 hands. I listened to the chaotic sounds of his wicked wife maliciously destroying my kitchen. I felt the sharp, stinging pain of his knuckles pressing violently into my collarbone. I slowly lowered my gaze, looking carefully at the desperate, sweating hands currently gripping the collar of my robe. The time for playing the weak, confused victim had officially expired. The storm had finally broken, and it was time for the absolute destruction of their lies. I slowly raised my hands. Brad was still screaming, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged against my skin. He fully expected me to raise my hands in a defensive, trembling surrender. He expected the frail, medicated old man to beg for mercy. Instead, I calmly reached up and wrapped my thick fingers directly around his wrists. I had spent 40 years on commercial construction sites. I had spent 4 decades swinging heavy framing hammers, hauling raw lumber, and wrestling with steel rebar. Age had certainly turned my hair gray, but it had not stolen the raw, dense muscle built into my forearms. I locked my grip around his pale, manicured wrists and squeezed. I applied a steady, crushing pressure, pressing my thumbs deeply into the sensitive tendons just below the base of his hands. Brad immediately stopped screaming. His mouth snapped shut. A sudden, sharp look of genuine shock flashed across his sweating face as a bolt of intense physical pain shot up his arms. He instinctively tried to pull away from me, but my grip was like a steel vise. I did not let him go. I stared directly into his wide, panicked eyes, letting the heavy silence stretch between us for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, with a sudden, violent burst of physical strength that completely caught him off guard, I forcefully peeled his hands off the collar of my robe. I shoved him backward with a hard, aggressive thrust to his chest. Brad stumbled awkwardly backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping against the smooth hardwood floor of the entryway. He caught his balance just before hitting the opposite wall, his chest heaving as he stared at me in complete disbelief. I did not cower. I did not shuffle my feet. I stood up perfectly straight, pulling my shoulders back to my full height, immediately dwarfing his presence in the narrow hallway. I smoothed out the wrinkled fabric of my collar with deliberate, agonizingly slow precision. The pathetic, shuffling, confused old man was entirely gone. The illusion had served its purpose, and I was finally stepping out of the humiliating shadows. "Hello, Paradol, Monica, really." My voice was like a shard of solid ice. It did not waver. It did not tremble. It cut through the chaotic noise of the house with absolute devastating clarity. The frenzied sounds of destruction radiating from the kitchen came to an abrupt, violent halt. The heavy wooden drawer that Monica had been aggressively pulling from the cabinet slipped from her grasp and crashed loudly onto the ceramic tile. The silverware scattered across the floor with a sharp metallic clatter. The sudden, suffocating silence that followed was incredibly heavy. Monica slowly stepped out from behind the granite island. Her face was entirely drained of color, leaving her skin looking like pale gray ash. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The name of the heavy antipsychotic drug hung in the cold morning air between us, completely destroying the comfortable narrative she had spent 3 months building. She knew exactly what that specific medical word meant. It meant that I knew. It meant that her entire wicked, poisonous game had been completely uncovered. How Brad whispered, his voice trembling, as he looked back and forth between me and his terrified wife. "You were fading. You could not even remember your own conversations." I ignored his pathetic stammering. I walked calmly past him, my footsteps heavy and resolute on the hardwood floor. I moved directly into the kitchen, keeping my eyes locked firmly on Monica. She instinctively took a slow step backward, pressing her back tightly against the stainless steel refrigerator. She was shaking her chest, rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. I reached into the deep pocket of my morning robe and pulled out a thick, folded stack of papers. I had meticulously prepared this specific dossier during the long, agonizing hours of the night. Every single page represented a nail in the coffin they had tried to build for me. I walked up to the granite island and forcefully slapped the documents down onto the smooth stone surface. The sharp smack made Monica flinch violently. I spread the papers out with a sharp, aggressive sweep of my hand. The very first document was the official toxicology report from the emergency veterinary clinic, clearly highlighting the lethal concentration of haloperidol found in our golden retriever. I tapped my heavy index finger directly onto the bold black letters spelling out the toxic substance. Beside it, I placed the crystal-clear, high-definition photographs I had secretly taken in their restricted filing room. The images perfectly captured their massive, fraudulent Medicare billing invoices and the corresponding delivery logs, listing my empty commercial dirt lots. Finally, I dropped the detailed typed transcript of the audio recording I had captured from my private study. It was a verbatim record of their cold, calculated plan to rob me, frame me, and institutionalize my wife. "Did you honestly think the man who paid for your Ivy League education could not do basic math?" I asked, my voice rising with a dark, commanding authority that echoed off the kitchen walls. "Did you truly believe that I would just quietly fade away into the shadows so you could easily steal my money and systematically destroy my mind?" Brad slowly walked into the kitchen, his eyes glued to the devastating evidence spread across the island. He looked at the photographs of his own fraudulent ledgers. He saw the undeniable proof of his multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate resting on his father's kitchen counter. The terrifying reality of his situation was finally crashing down upon him. The federal wire transfer had bounced. His massive criminal operation was completely frozen. And his primary fall guy was actually the mastermind behind his absolute destruction. "You poisoned my wife." I continued stepping toward Monica. You walked into my home, smiled in her face, and fed her heavy sedatives to make her docile. You actively tried to destroy the mind of the woman who welcomed you into this family with open arms. You are a disgusting, pathetic excuse for a human being." Monica let out a choked, terrified sob. She covered her face with her hands, sliding slowly down the front of the refrigerator until she was sitting on the cold tile floor. She was completely broken, entirely consumed by the terrifying knowledge that she was going to spend decades in a federal prison. But Brad was not broken. As he stared at the damning evidence on the counter, the sheer panic in his eyes rapidly mutated into something much darker. The realization that his entire life was completely over ignited a violent, desperate rage inside his chest. He looked at the printed transcript detailing his treacherous plan to lock me away in a facility. He realized that the documents resting on the island and the cell phone secured in my pocket were the only things standing between him and absolute freedom. He let out a visceral, guttural roar. He lunged forward, completely abandoning any remaining shred of humanity, launching his body weight directly at me with a desperate, violent intent. Brad lunged forward with a desperate, guttural roar. His hands were outstretched, his fingers hooked into rigid claws as he aimed directly for the heavy stack of printed evidence resting on the granite countertop. He was completely blinded by sheer panic, willing to physically assault his own father just to destroy the damning paper trail. I did not step back. I did not flinch or raise my arms to defend myself. I simply planted my feet firmly against the hardwood floor and stared directly into his wild, bloodshot eyes. I knew something that he did not. I knew that my front door was no longer locked, before his hands could even graze the edge of the kitchen island. A deafening crash shattered the chaotic noise of the room. The heavy oak front door of my home was violently kicked completely off its brass hinges. The thick wood slammed back with an explosive splintering crack that sent pieces of drywall raining down onto the foyer floor. A flood of dark tactical gear and heavily armed federal agents poured instantly into the entryway. There were 6 of them, moving with a terrifying, synchronized precision that instantly paralyzed everyone in the room. They wore dark bulletproof vests emblazoned with bold yellow federal insignia, their tactical rifles raised and perfectly leveled. "Federal agents, nobody move. Show me your hands right now." The commanding voice boomed through the house, carrying an absolute, unquestionable authority. Mitchell Reed stepped smoothly through the ruined doorway, closely following the tactical entry team. I was no longer wearing the casual denim jacket from the diner. He wore a sharp, dark suit, his federal badge clipped prominently to his belt, gleaming in the morning light. He looked directly at me and offered a single, highly professional nod of confirmation. The federal cavalry had officially arrived. Brad froze entirely mid-stride. The aggressive momentum of his lunge evaporated in an instant, replaced by a look of profound, paralyzing horror. He slowly turned his head toward the front hallway, staring blankly at the overwhelming display of heavily armed federal power actively swarming into his childhood home. The reality of his absolute destruction finally crashed down upon him. He instinctively raised his hands above his head, his fingers trembling violently. 2 federal agents closed the distance between them in the blink of an eye. They did not offer gentle instructions. They grabbed Brad by the shoulders, spun him around roughly, and forcefully slammed his chest against the painted drywall of the hallway. The impact knocked the remaining breath from his lungs. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the tense silence of the room. He let out a pathetic, whimpering groan as an agent aggressively patted him down for weapons. Monica, completely shattered. The cool, calculating chief financial officer who had spent the last 3 months systematically poisoning my wife, vanished entirely. She dropped to her knees on the cold ceramic tile of the kitchen floor, her designer dress crumpling around her. She threw her hands over her face and began to scream. It was a shrill, hysterical wail of absolute, unadulterated terror. The moment a female agent stepped forward and firmly grabbed her arm, Monica desperately turned on her own husband. "It was his idea!" Monica shrieked, pointing a shaking accusatory finger directly at Brad as the agent aggressively pulled her arms behind her back. He forced me to do the accounting. He made the connections with the offshore syndicate, I told him. The Medicare billing was too risky, but he would not listen to me. I will tell you everything you need to know about his network. Just please do not hurt me. I will testify against him. She was sobbing hysterically, completely willing to trade the man she married for a slightly reduced prison sentence. Brad turned his head awkwardly against the wall, staring at his screaming wife with a look of utter disgust and profound betrayal. He realized in that exact moment that there was absolutely no loyalty among thieves. The wicked partnership they had built on a foundation of greed and manipulation was rapidly dissolving into desperate, self-preserving chaos. The agents efficiently secured Monica with steel handcuffs and hoisted her roughly to her feet. She continued to sob wildly, her mascara running in thick, dark streams down her pale cheeks. They marched her forcefully out the front door, her hysterical cries slowly fading into the cool morning air as she was shoved into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. Brad was left standing in the hallway, his hands secured tightly behind his back. The aggressive agent holding his shoulder turned him around so he was directly facing the kitchen island. He looked at the heavy stack of photographic evidence, the toxicology report, and the typed transcript resting on the granite counter. He looked at Mitchell Reed, who was calmly securing the physical documents into a specialized evidence bag. Finally, his bloodshot eyes drifted slowly upward until they locked directly onto mine. His face was completely pale, shining, with a thick layer of cold sweat. The arrogant, wealthy corporate executive was totally gone. He looked exactly like a terrified, helpless little boy who had just been caught doing something terrible. The arrogant facade had completely crumbled, leaving nothing but sheer desperation in its wake. He realized that his fake commercial loan was blocked, his federal transfer was frozen, and his entire life was completely over. "Dad, please." Brad choked out, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate sob. Hot tears began to stream rapidly down his face. "Please tell them to stop. Tell them this is just a massive misunderstanding. You cannot let them take me away to a federal prison. I am your son, your family. Please, Dad, you have to help me." I was trying to play the ultimate emotional card. He was trying to weaponize the deep, unconditional love that a father naturally holds for his child. He fully expected me to break down, to weep for him, and to beg the federal agents to show him mercy. He thought the biological bond we shared would somehow override the terrible crimes he had committed. I stood perfectly still behind the kitchen island. I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear. I looked at the man standing in handcuffs, searching my heart for any lingering trace of paternal affection. I found absolutely nothing but cold, empty ash. I thought about my innocent wife, Patricia, sitting quietly in the other room, recovering from the heavy mind-altering sedatives he had willingly allowed his wife to feed her. I looked deeply into his panicked, pleading eyes. I leaned slightly forward, resting my large, calloused hands flat against the cold granite surface of the counter. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single syllable carried the heavy, devastating weight of absolute finality. "You stopped being my son the exact day you decided to put poison in your mother's glass," I said, my voice radiating a chilling, absolute coldness that made him physically flinch. "You are nothing to me now. Take him out of my house." Brad let out a devastated, agonizing wail as the federal agents firmly grabbed his shoulders. He thrashed weakly against their grip, twisting his neck to look back at me, tears streaming endlessly down his red face. He continued to scream my name, begging and pleading for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I simply turned my back to him, refusing to offer him the satisfaction of a final glance. I listened to his frantic boots scraping against the hardwood floor. I listened to the heavy, broken front door scrape against the entryway tiles as they aggressively shoved him outside. And finally, I listened to the heavy metallic slam of the armored transport door, echoing loudly down the quiet suburban street. The chaotic storm had completely passed. The house was suddenly enveloped in a thick, profound silence. I let out a long, shuddering breath, feeling the massive, crushing weight of the last 3 days slowly begin to lift from my weary shoulders. I walked over to the kitchen sink, gripped the porcelain edges, and lowered my head. I had done it. I had successfully protected my wife, secured my financial future, and completely destroyed the monsters who had tried to bury us alive. Mitchell Reed walked quietly into the kitchen, his polished shoes tapping softly against the tile. He stood beside me, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflecting brightly off the front window panes. He let out a low, respectful whistle. "You executed that maneuver with absolute perfection," Richard Mitchell said quietly, a tone of genuine admiration ringing clearly in his voice. The federal wire transfer triggered the exact threshold alarms we anticipated. The stolen money is completely frozen in the network, and the offshore syndicate is entirely exposed. You handed the Department of Justice a flawless, airtight criminal case wrapped up with a perfect bow. I turned to him and offered a tired, genuine smile. I told him I was just incredibly grateful that my retirement funds were finally safe. I said I was ready to simply move on with my life and focus entirely on helping Patricia fully recover her strength. The bright flashing lights slowly faded from my front windows, leaving the street in absolute peace. The storm had broken, leaving a profound stillness. Patricia slowly walked into the kitchen, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. We sat down together at the island. The shattered remains of our front door rested in the hallway. Mitchell Reed took a seat across from us, shifting back to a calculating investigator. He folded his hands, letting out a long sigh. "The dust has settled," Richard Mitchell said, his voice steady. "The extraction team secured the perimeter. Your son and his wife are sitting in separate federal holding cells downtown. They have absolutely no access to phones, lawyers, or the outside world." I nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of his words. I asked him to explain exactly what would happen to them now. I needed to understand the full legal scope of the destruction they brought upon themselves. Mitchell leaned forward. He explained the federal prosecutors were not just hitting them with standard corporate fraud charges, because they systematically used a network of ghost addresses and kickbacks. The Department of Justice officially invoked the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This legal maneuver gave the government absolute power over every asset Brad and Monica acquired over the last 5 years. By sunset today, Mitchell detailed the asset. Forfeiture teams will have completely seized their entire luxury estate. The high-end vehicles in their garage will be impounded and towed to a federal holding lot. Even the massive luxury yacht they were shopping for is surrounded by federal harbor police. Under RICO statutes, any asset purchased with laundered federal money is permanently confiscated. They will lose absolutely everything. They will not even have enough clean money left to afford a defense attorney. A sharp sense of justice washed over me. Monica had stood in this kitchen an hour ago, screaming hysterically about offshore accounts. Now she was sitting in a cold, concrete cell, stripped of her stolen wealth. But the legal fallout did not stop with my son and his wicked wife. I asked Mitchell about the $4 million commercial loan that started this entire nightmare. I asked how federal authorities were handling the forged documents sitting inside the bank branch. Mitchell offered a genuinely amused smile. He told me the irony of the situation was truly spectacular. While the tactical team was busy breaking down my front door to arrest Brad, a secondary coordinated federal unit quietly walked directly into the main lobby of the bank. Greg, the branch manager, who proudly congratulated me on Tuesday morning, was sitting in the back of an armored vehicle in federal custody. Mitchell explained investigators uncovered a massive digital paper trail connecting Greg directly to Monica. Greg knowingly bypassed mandatory security protocols to push the fraudulent commercial loan through underwriting. In exchange, Monica secretly wired him a massive kickback fee disguised as a consulting bonus. Greg thought he was a brilliant financial mastermind. Instead, he carelessly left a glowing digital footprint, that led agents directly to his desk. Furthermore, Mitchell continued shifting his attention to the broader corporate picture. Caldwell Medical Supply is officially dead. The federal government initiated an immediate aggressive liquidation protocol. Every single warehouse, every piece of inventory, and every corporate bank account is completely frozen and actively being seized. The entire fraudulent distribution network is permanently dismantled. They will never steal another dime from the Medicare system. I let out a long, slow breath. The sheer scale of the federal operation was absolutely staggering. I looked down at my calloused hands, thinking about the 40 years of honest labor I put into my construction business. I built a legacy based entirely on hard work and unyielding integrity. My son tried to build an empire on a foundation of lies, theft, and chemical poison. The absolute collapse of his criminal syndicate was a harsh, undeniable testament to the fragile nature of greed. I turned to Mitchell and asked the most critical question of the morning. I asked about the safety of my own money. I needed absolute confirmation that the $2.8 million I moved in the dead of night was truly secure. Mitchell nodded firmly, his expression softening with genuine reassurance. "Your retirement portfolio is perfectly safe, Richard," he promised. "The temporary federal holding account you utilized at 3 in the morning performed its function flawlessly. The fraudulent $1.5 million wire transfer from the Medicare syndicate was successfully intercepted and permanently quarantined. Now that the primary arrests are officially executed and the secure perimeter is established, my team is actively initiating the final transfer protocols. Your entire life savings will be seamlessly routed back into a highly encrypted personal account under your exclusive control by the end of the business day. They did not get a single penny of your money." Patricia gently squeezed my arm, a profound wave of relief washing over her face. "We survived the ultimate betrayal. We successfully protected our future, our home, and our freedom." I felt a deep peace settling into my weary bones. The terrible storm finally passed, and we were completely unharmed. But as I prepared to thank Mitchell for his incredible life-saving guidance, the seasoned federal investigator held up his hand. He carefully reached into the interior breast pocket of his dark suit jacket. He slowly withdrew the thick manila envelope bearing the official embossed seal of the United States Department of Justice. He placed it deliberately onto the granite surface of the kitchen island, sliding it smoothly across the stone until it rested directly in front of me. "We successfully secured your original assets," Richard Mitchell said softly, his voice dropping to a low, incredibly serious register. "We completely dismantled the medical supply syndicate, arrested the primary conspirators, and permanently neutralized the fraudulent loan. The defensive phase of our entire operation is now officially and fully concluded. However, we now need to discuss the secondary affirmative phase of your signed legal agreement." I stared down at the heavy sealed envelope resting on the counter. The thick paper felt incredibly significant, radiating a quiet, undeniable power. I looked back up at Mitchell, my heart beginning to beat with a strange kind of anticipation. Mitchell tapped his index finger firmly against the golden federal seal. "As I briefly mentioned, the chaos erupted. This morning, the False Claims Act dictates very specific, non-negotiable financial rewards for private citizens who actively facilitate the recovery of stolen federal funds. You did not just provide a simple anonymous tip. You courageously weaponized your own financial identity, executed a highly dangerous midnight transfer, and successfully trapped $1.5 million of stolen money in an undeniable federal snare. Because of your direct, fearless intervention, the government is poised to recover tens of millions of dollars from this liquidated criminal empire." He paused, letting the gravity of his words fill the quiet kitchen. He gestured slowly toward the heavy envelope. "Inside this package is the official preliminary documentation for your personal whistleblower reward. You need to open it, Richard. You need to see exactly how much your courage is truly worth." Inside those pages lay the absolute culmination of the entire federal sting operation. by legally acting as a verified whistleblower and allowing the authorities to actively monitor the transfer of stolen funds through my secure tripwire, I had fundamentally broken my son's syndicate. Under the strict, uncompromising guidelines of the Federal False Claims Act, a private citizen who actively assists the government in recovering stolen federal funds is legally entitled to a substantial percentage of the entire recovered amount. Because my highly coordinated action had directly led to the immediate seizure of $15 million in fraudulent cash spanning across their hidden offshore accounts, the Department of Justice was officially executing my reward. I opened the thick folder and stared at the official documentation. The federal government was legally transferring $3 million directly into my secure holding account. It was a massive tax-free reward for exposing the brutal corruption. My son had maliciously tried to steal my entire $2.8 million retirement portfolio to fund his reckless lifestyle. Instead, his horrific crime had triggered a federal mechanism that more than doubled my entire personal net worth. The profound irony was absolutely staggering. Brad had meticulously forged my signature thinking he was entirely bulletproof. He had arrogantly believed that a quiet, retired old man would simply fold under pressure. But he had completely underestimated the fierce, unwavering protective instincts of a father who had spent 40 years building a life from nothing. He wanted to take everything I owned, and the very system he tried to manipulate ultimately handed me his entire fortune. Over the next 3 months, Patricia and I worked closely with federal prosecutors to completely dismantle the remaining toxic structures of Brad's life. We watched as the government aggressively seized his sprawling luxury estate, his collection of high-end vehicles, and every single penny sitting in Monica's secret Cayman Island accounts. The massive corporate medical supply distribution company was officially liquidated, entirely erased from existence. Brad eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe elder abuse. During his final sentencing hearing, he stood in the sterile courtroom wearing a standard orange jumpsuit. He looked up at me from the defense table, his eyes hollow and utterly defeated. The judge did not show him a single ounce of mercy. He was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of any possibility of early parole. Monica received a 15-year sentence for her active malicious complicity in the intricate financial cover-up and the deliberate physical poisoning of my wife. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to the heavy gavel slam down, I did not feel a triumphant, explosive sense of victory. I simply felt a deep, overwhelming wave of sorrow. No father ever wants to see the boy he raised standing in shackles, destined to grow old behind a wall of concrete and barbed wire. But as I reached over and gently took Patricia's warm hand in mine, I felt an absolute, profound peace. I had successfully protected the woman I loved more than anything in the world. I had defended our home, secured our future, and entirely removed a dangerous, toxic element from our lives. The following week, Patricia and I made a major, life-changing decision. The large, empty suburban house had simply gathered too many dark, painful memories. We legally transferred the property deed to a local charitable foundation, completely washing our hands of the burdensome past. With the massive federal reward money sitting securely in our accounts, we purchased a stunning state-of-the-art Airstream recreational vehicle. We loaded our few remaining personal belongings, packed the golden retriever securely in the back seat, and drove completely out of Chicago. The first few weeks on the road were a crucial period of intense healing. Getting the last traces of haloperidol out of Patricia's system wasn't just a physical detox, it was an emotional one as well. We parked our Airstream in a quiet, secluded RV resort at the base of the Colorado Rockies for nearly a month. Every morning we would sit outside under the awning, drinking fresh coffee and listening to the wind rustle through the alpine pines. I watched day by day as the vibrant, sharp woman I married slowly returned to me. The lingering fog in her eyes dissipated, replaced by that familiar warm spark that had captivated me 50 years ago. she started reading her massive historical novels again, devouring chapters with a fierce concentration. Buster, our golden retriever, completely recovered from his terrifying ordeal and spent his days happily chasing mountain squirrels and napping in the cool, high-altitude sun. The physical distance from Chicago worked like a miraculous balm on our wounded spirits. We didn't talk about Brad or Monica. We didn't watch the news to see the ongoing fallout of their criminal trials. We consciously chose to leave that toxic chapter buried in the ashes of our old life. Instead, we focused on the simple, beautiful mechanics of our new nomadic existence. We learned how to hook up water lines, map out national park routes, and cook elaborate meals on a tiny 2-burner propane stove. We met other travelers, retired couples, young digital nomads, and adventurous families who knew nothing about our traumatic past. To them, we were just Richard and Patricia, a happy older couple, exploring the country with a goofy dog. Reclaiming our anonymity was the greatest gift the open road gave us. We have spent the last few months traveling endlessly across the beautiful open highways of the country. We have watched the sun rise brilliantly over the vast plains of the Midwest and hiked slowly through the towering, majestic redwoods of the Pacific Northwest. Today, we are parked on a high, secluded ridge directly overlooking the breathtaking expanse of the Grand Canyon. The massive, jagged red rocks drop miles into the earth, painting a stunning portrait of absolute quiet freedom. As the sun begins to set, casting deep, fiery shadows across the massive canyon walls, I feel my cell phone vibrate gently in my pocket. I pull it out and look at the screen. It is a standard automated notification from my bank. My monthly interest dividends have been securely deposited. My funds are completely safe. The dark, terrifying nightmare is permanently over. I silence the phone and slip it away. I turn to Patricia, wrapping my arm securely around her shoulders. We stand together in the cool evening breeze, watching the sky turn a brilliant shade of gold. We survived because we absolutely refused to play the helpless victim. We faced the harsh reality of our situation and systematically dismantled the wicked scheme entirely from the inside out. Betrayal often comes wearing a familiar face and a warm smile. As we age, it is incredibly natural to want to trust our children completely, to hand over the reins and seek a quiet peace. But blind trust is a very dangerous luxury. Never surrender your financial independence, your passwords, or your legal autonomy just to keep the peace. The greatest lesson I learned is that true love protects while greedy entitlement strictly manipulates. If your gut ever tells you something is wrong, you must listen to it. Protect your mind. Protect your spouse and never underestimate your ability to fight back against those who wish you harm. If you found value in my story today, or if you have ever had to deal with a devastating financial betrayal within your own family, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below telling me exactly where you are watching from and how you would have handled this terrifying situation. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and sharing more stories with you very soon. We want to hear from you. We read every single comment. Please hit the subscribe button to support. Thank you.